And here we turn to Daf Samaches Amid Beis. And Vlada Kamosa Minolan. How do we know that if a Jewish man has a relation with a Shivcha Knanis, the child is an Eved? And the Gemara answers the Amar Kra in the Parsha of Eved Ivri. There's something called Yud, in which the Torah says in Parshas Mishpatim that the Adon could designate a Shivcha Knanis as a marriage partner for the Eved Ivri. And the Torah says that if there are Vlados born of that marriage, then after 6 years, when the Eved Ivri goes free, in other words, the child that's born from this relation between a Jew, an Eved Ivri in this case, and a Shivcha Knainis is going to be miyuchas to his mother, not miyuchas to his father, which means that he is an Eved Knani. And if he would be miyuchas to his father, he'd be Yisrael, because it's the Eved Ivri is, but because he's miyuchas to his mother, and that's called Vlad Kemosa, therefore the Vlad Atiyah Ledoner, meaning that the Vlad is an Eved Knani or a Shivcha Knanis. What about Nochris? What about the case of a Jewish man, Nishfakedim Gedach, who's married to a non-Jewish Shiksa? Minolan, how do we know that there's no Tfisas Kiddushin with a non-Jew? And the answer is Amar Kravalos is Chatein Bum, and we're learning that Lotus Chatein Bum means that there's no Torah's Chasnus with regard to a Nochris, to a Shiksa. And therefore, a Kiddushin Tovs. Gemara clarifies, Ashkechana de lo tafsi be Kiddushin, Vlada Kamosa Minolan. How do we know that the child that's born to a Jewish man, a Jewish father, and a non-Jewish mother is a Nochri, Kemosa? And this is the question that is so fundamental, that a person's religion is determined by the mother, not by the father. The Torah says in Dvarim Perek Zayin, Bitcha lo site livno, ubito lo sikach livanecha, ki yasir es bincha me'acharai. And what does this mean? Bincha should not marry a goya, and Bitcha should not marry a goy. That's the beginning of the pasuk, which is not written in the Gemara, but it's in the Torah. And nevertheless, in the next pasuk, it says, Yasir es bincha. In other words, if the husband is a guy and he's married to Bitcha, who's a Jewess, then Yasir es binah. Yasir es binah means that the ben is not going to be Jewish. Bincha bam Yisrael is kari bincha, but ein bincha bam min haoves kochavim kari bincha ela binah. So there's a yichus here to the mother who's a goya, and that's called in the Torah's language ki yasir is bincha me'acharai, and the case is of a ba min haoves kochavim, that his mother is a non-Jew. If, on the other hand, it's bincha bam Yisraelis, then kari bincha. Amar Ravina says that I'm going to derive from these words, this ruling of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, that when it says ki yasir is bincha me'acharai, it's not bincha shem yasirenu, but rather she yasirenu chosno me'acharei Hashem. Is that be the case? Shma mina ben bitcha haba min ovid kochavim kari bincha. So if you have the son of your daughter, and this son was born to a non-Jewish father, the grandson is called bincha. In other words, he has a din of Yisrael. And now we understand why there's a pen yasur me'acharei Hashem. But ben bincha, if it's not the son of your Jewish daughter, but rather the son of your Jewish son, that grandson, even though he's biologically your grandson because he's the son of your son, but nevertheless, his father was a guy, I should say his mother was a guy, I should say, that's more precise, That's not considered bincha. Nema Kasava Ravina, shall we assume that according to Ravina, Oved Kochavim the Eved Abal Bas Yisrael Havlad Mamzer, that if there's a relationship between a non-Jew and a Jewish girl, the Vlad is a mamzer. In other words, the yichus is not to the father. If the yichus would have been to the father, then through gerus he could be mutar b'kol, but rather yichus is to the mother. Do you follow? Let's go over that logic one more time. It's a little bit tricky. If the child of this marriage, of this intermarriage, we'll call it, would be miyuchas to his father, then just like his father's a guy, he would be a guy, and after gerus he can marry any Jewish woman. But in this case, the Torah is saying that the yichus is to the mother, which means that he is Jewish by birth, but he was born to Avera because she had a marriage relationship with a non-Jew, who's his father. Is a Vlad is a mamzer. Now, this is based on the third klal in the Mishnah Samach Vav, which we didn't do today, but we did it 2 days ago, that if there's no Kiddushin Tofsin and there's an Avera, then the Vlad is a mamzer. So in the case of a Jewish woman married to a non-Jewish man, a Gentile man, there's no Tfisis Kiddushin because of Amadom L'chamor. And there is an Avera, the Torah says, Lo Tischatem Bam. And therefore, according to the klal of the Mishnah, the Vlad is a mamzer. So we want to now come to a radical conclusion, asks the Gemara, that a Goyish father and a Jewish mother, the Vlad is a mamzer. So Gemara rejects it. Nehi de koshelo havi. I certainly agree with you that this was nolda be'avera because there was a violation of tischatein bam when this Jewish woman married a guy. Okay, fine. He's not a kosher, the child, but mamzer lo havi, right? Mamzer only applies when there's no kiddushay aviv tofsim be'imo. But if the father's a guy, then he can't create Kiddushin with any woman, any Jewish woman. And therefore the Vlad is not a mamzer. He's Pasul Mikri, but he's not a mamzer. So now the Gemara asks the following question. How could you possibly derive from the Pasul of Tischatein Bam and from the Pasul Ki Yosir Espincha Me'achorai that there's no Tfisis Kiddushin from any of the Goyim, and the ben is miyuchas to ima goyer? Hahu b'shiva goyim ksiv. That parsha of lo tischatein bam or ki yosef bin chamechor is in the parsha of Shiva Goyim, the 7 Palestinian nations that occupied Palestine. And it's possible that only with regard to these noshim from those 7 nations, that's when the Torah says ein kiddushin tovsim b'hem. In other words, the Torah is more machmer with regard to those 7 nations. Harai, the Torah says they have to destroy them. And the Vlados are now going to be miyuchas to the mother. But Shara Umas Minolan, how do you know to extend that to other nations? On my Kra, the Torah says, Ki Yosser is bincha me'achorai is l'rabos kol ha'mesirim. Meaning, any nation of the world that would be gorem hasoras habonim me'achori Hashem. So ein kedushin tovs. Ha'anicha, the Gemara asks, that makes sense. Li Rabbi Shimon, and this Rabbi Shimon is a very famous Rabbi Shimon that's quoted all over Shas, but we'll mention the paradigmic statement of Rabbi Shimon in Bava Metzia Daf Kuf Tes Vav. The Darshinan type of the Kra that the Torah gives us license, even in a halachic context, to derive conclusions based on our analysis of the underlying reason of a mitzvah or a lotasa, even though the Torah didn't give us that reason. Me'atzmenu, on our own, we have the authority, according to Reb Shimon, to suggest the tam, the underlying reason, in this case, of hasara me'achore Hashem. And therefore, when we read hasara me'achore Hashem, we understand that this is the reason why the Torah said that you can't have the intermarriage. A Jewish girl marrying a goy, or a Jewish man marrying a goyita. And we could say that the Isra only applies to Shiva Amamim. Why? Because they were Ovdei Avodah Zarah. They were Adukim Be'Avodah Zarah. So why did the Torah go out of its way to say Mesirim Me'achorei Hashem? That's a ribui to tell us the time of the Krah that is therefore applicable to every nation on the face of the earth. Hence, we derive the conclusion of Ein Tfisas Kiddushin B'Shar Umas HaOlam. That works out beautifully if you're like Rabbi Shimon, that Darshin in time of the Krah. El Rabbanon, my time. Rabbanon are absolutely opposed to darshaning the time of the mitzvahs, and therefore, when the Torah says that the Isur is because of Hasara Me'achorei Hashem, and therefore we want to apply it to other nations, we can't do so. We're going to take the pasuk literally as referring to the Shiva Amamim, even though again there's no logical distinction really between Shiva Amamim and other nations. It's always a chashash of Hasara Me'achorei Hashem. And Gemara answers on Makra, the pasuk says in the parasha of Eishes Ifas Toar, in Perek Chafalf, meaning the beginning of Kitetze, the Acher Kain Tovoleo Bialta by Solach Elisha. But what do we see in this pasuk? After there was Gerus, which is the entire process of Eishes Ifas Toar, then you be allowed to marry. Michlal Demei Kara, before she actually undergoes formal Gerus, Lo Tafsi Bei Kiddushin. There's no Tfisas Kiddushin. In other words, the din of Eishes Ifas Torah means you go out to war, what we call a Melchemes Rishus, against other nations of the world, not against the 7 nations that were obligated to destroy. So the Torah says that after the Eishes Ifas Torah goes through the entire process, then she becomes a Giores, she undergoes Gerus, and then you can marry her. And there is Tfisas Kiddushin. But the implication is that before her Gerus, there would be no Tfisas Kiddushin. And since Eishes Ifas Torah is referring to Melchemes Rishus of Shar Umos HaOlam, not specifically to Shiva Amim, therefore we see that Ein Kiddushin Tovsin B'Shar Umos HaOlam. Frek the Gemara Ashkechan to Lo Tavsi Kiddushin. Fine. So if a man marries a Goya, there's no Kiddushin. But Vlada Kamosa Minola, how do you know the Vlad is like the mother and is non-Jewish? On Makra, the Torah says, Ki siena le'ish te noshim, hachas ahuva chasnu v'yoldu lo bonim. So we have a smichus here between the beginning of the pasuk and the end of the pasuk. At the beginning of the pasuk says ki siena, which is a lashon of ishus and kiddushin, and v'yoldu lo. We're going to darshan called hecha de karina be ki siena karina be v'yoldu lo. V'yoldu lo means that the child is a Jew, like the father, but that's only if there's kiddushin tovsin ba, meaning tiyena. And then, if it's ki tiyena and it's kedushin tovsin ba, then v'yoldu lo, the vlad is miyaches lo miyuchas lo le'av. But kol hecha de lo karina be ki siyena, if there's no tfis kedushin at all for anyone, like a goya, nobody could make a valid kedushin with a goya. Is lo karina be v'yoldu lo. The vlad also not miyuchasim to the father, but rather to the mother, who's a goya. Ihachi frek the Gemara shivcha nami. And the Gemara answers, Einochi nami, ela isha v'yoladeh tiel adonel lamali L'cheresanya. So this is the brisa that's going to lead us to the Mishnah, and we're going to turn now to Daf Samach Tes very quickly. Ha'omer l'shivchaso. He has a shivcha knainis who's muberes, and now he's being meshachera, and he says hareat b'nei baschorin, but viladayach eved. The child that you have inside your womb will be mine, and he's an eved. And on this we have machlokes. And first we understand the shita of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. Havlad kemosa. The vlad is meshuchrar just like the mother. Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. Chachamim omrim, they disagree. Dvar of kayamin. That when the master made that t'nai in the shichrur, it's a valid t'nai. And even though the mother is meshuchreres, the vlad remains an eved. Yishum shenemar ha'isha v'yolda v'yoladea tiyaledonea. So the Gemara says, my Talmudah, how can Chachamim interpret this pasuk to derive the conclusion that if the Adon is Meshacher, the pregnant woman, the Vlad from this woman remains an Eved even after the woman is Meshuchra and she becomes a Yoris? Amar Kra Adar Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. This is the drush of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, that the Adon, the master, cannot be Meshacher, the mother, in order to remain, so to speak, in possession and lahashus avlad avdo, because it says ha'isha v'yoladeh tia ladonea, kol zman sha'isha shivcha ladonea, af avlad sheteluru eved ladon. Ach, im ein ha'isha shivcha, ein vlada nasa eved. And that leads us here to the Mishnah on Daf Samach Tes, which is the last Mishnah in Perek HaOmer. Okay then, so let's wish you a great Shabbat, Shabbos Kodesh, and Emir Hashem, I'll see you on Yom Rishon.